All right, thanks everybody for coming. Alain is here. He's going to give us a talk on progressive web apps. If there are no other questions or anything, I will hand it over to him. And let's see here. Everyone just kind of remember, please, to keep your microphones on mute unless you have a question of some sort, and then unmute and ask your question as we get going. But it'd be helpful to have like the microphones off to drown out background noise and such while we do the presentation. And with that, take it away, sir.
All right, thanks a lot. So before I get started, I cannot share my screen. So that's something I'm gonna need a little bit.
You go try that. It should be fixed now.
Yep, it is working. So starting screen share right now. So I guess it's working. Can you see everything?
See your intro slide deck.
Perfect. All right. So tonight we're going to talk about progressive web apps. And this is a talk I've been giving quite a few times in the past. And it's always one of my most successful talks because it gets people excited about technology, which is always a good thing. Makes my job easier as a speaker. So we're going to get into what they are, these progressive web apps, and what kind of features are behind them. Before I do that, just a few words about myself. So my name is Alain. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, more specifically Angular and Google Maps. And I've been working on the web for quite a while now. So started with AngularJS back in 2011. So that's 10 years this year. Wow, that's a lot. And what I do for a living is basically consulting, training, mentoring, teaching around Angular. And I have my own website for that, which is angulartraining.com. And I'm based in Sacramento, where I also organize the GDG Sacramento meetup group, which merged a few years ago with the Angular meetup group. So now it's really just one entity where we talk about all things web, and we meet on the second Thursday of the month. And of course, these days, everything is online, just like everybody else because of COVID. So that's me. Now, progressive web apps. So first things first, I'm going to ask you a few questions. So you can use the chat to answer, I guess. So first, has anybody ever heard about progressive web apps? So I see one yes. I see only yeses. So they already know everything. Yeah, it looks like most people have a good idea about progressive web apps. They heard about it. What about responsive web apps? Most likely the same. When people know progressive web apps, they know responsive web apps. Now, the next one is not really a question in the sense that usually 99% of the audience is going to answer yes to that one. Has anyone done a Google search over the past 24 hours? So that would be rare. Someone says, no, never do that. Now, something that is a little bit less frequent, I would say, is, has anyone been to an app store, let's say Google Play or Apple store over the past 24 hours? Yeah, so I get no's for the first time. Because that's something we do less regularly, right? That's something that happens when we have a very specific need, where we know that we are looking for something specific, but it's not the first way we're going to look for something. Usually we're going to start with a search engine, make a request, find some info that may lead us to an app store later, but it's rarely the very first thing that we do when we're looking for a new app or a new something. So what are progressive web apps? A progressive web app, the main idea behind a progressive web app is that instead of having to create a web app, an Android application, and an iOS application, you're just going to have a web app. You're just going to create one application, one JavaScript, HTML, CSS based app. And that's going to be your application for all platforms, really. That's really the idea behind the progressive web app. So there's many benefits to that. The first one is having a frictionless install process, because you've done that before, right? You go to an app store, you decide to download something, and you see that it's downloaded like 250 megabytes. And you're like, well, it's just a very tiny app that's supposed to do almost nothing. I don't want 250 megabytes of stuff just to do that. So there is some friction, definitely, to get things installed on mobile devices. Especially, so in the US, you know, people have fairly recent phones and we have good networks and things work pretty smoothly. But outside of the US, that's not the case. So if you are on another continent, you might not enjoy a fast internet, or at least not on a mobile device. And you might not have the latest generation of smartphone either, which means that the latest Android or the latest Apple application is not necessarily work very well on your device. So that's friction. That's basically things that people are going to think twice about installing a new app. Whereas with a progressive web app, well, there's really not much of an install, because once you have displayed the website, it's done. You have everything you need to run the application. You have the JavaScript, the CSS, the HTML. So that's really the idea. The two main things, the two main reasons why people would use progressive web apps is that you write your code only once, not 3 times. So you don't have to maintain 3 different code bases, and it's easier to install. There's less friction. It's more natural to get into a progressive web app than to get into a store and then download something. So the idea is really win-win all over the place. And usually when I talk about that, people tell me, well, that sounds too good to be true. That cannot exist. So the example I always take is the Starbucks app, which they actually have a progressive web app for that. And it is a pretty good idea. When you think about their business model, they want people to be able to order in a way that is really frictionless. They don't want you to download hundreds of megabytes of code of application before you can order something. So the idea is you go to the website, the app basically loads, and then you can do your order in a few taps of the screen. So this PWA is online. It's app.starbucks.com. And I'm going to demo it pretty quickly just to showcase all of the specific features of that progressive web app. So what makes it a progressive web app and how we can tell that it is not a native application. So now you should see a video on my screen that's going to play as I describe what's going on there. So that's my phone screen. That's why it was recorded up front to make sure that everything goes smoothly. I navigate to app.starbucks.com. This opens the app on the website. And as you can see at the bottom of my screen here, there is this prompt, add Starbucks to home screen. So this is something that the progressive web app is going to do. So this website is prompting me to install, basically, to add that application to the home screen of my phone. If I tap on it, I get another pop-up that's going to ask me to confirm. Do you want to add to home screen? Yes or no. And I did it. I tap OK. So now it has done it. And if I go to my home screen, now there is a shortcut to get to Starbucks. So when I talk about a frictionless install, that's really it, right? It's just you tap on your screen and it's installed right away. You don't have to wait for the download to happen or anything like this. So that's one of the big things with progressive web apps. Now, once this app is installed, there's another thing that's happening is that if I try to launch it, which is going to happen soon. So the application is then going to launch as its own as its own app, even if it's just still a website. When I open it, as you can see here, I have the Chrome browser application, and the other app down here is Starbucks itself. So even if it's a web app, a website, it is being loaded as its own self-contained application by the operating system, by Android in that case. And that app is going to have all of the styling, the colors, the logo, the title, and everything from my progressive web app. So it really looks like a 100% native application on that mobile device, even if it's not. It's just a web app that is being wrapped in a browser of its own. So it's great because now it really has the look and feel of something truly native. And in order to illustrate that, I'm going to close it. So I'm going to close Google Chrome. I'm going to close my Starbucks progressive web app and everything. And now I'm going to restart it. So just by tapping on the Starbucks logo, it's going to start my PWA, which means you see there's a splash screen pretty quickly with the logo, and then the application shows up full screen. So it doesn't show up in a browser tab. We don't see the URL or anything like this. It takes the entire screen just like a regular native application. So it's really a way to take your web app, make it look like a native application, and be able to distribute it to many people without having to publish that application on a store. So these are some of the benefits so far. So some of the characteristics, we saw many of them on the demo, but there's a few more that I'm going to mention. So a progressive web app, or PWA, it's a web app. It's just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. There's nothing, there's no native component to it. There's no requirement for a specific framework or API or anything. It is regular HTML, JavaScript, CSS. So when you go to that web app, it's going to prompt you to get installed. And if you do install it, then it's going to show up on the home screen of your phone, which you can, of course, remove and install just like a regular application. There's a splash screen that you can configure. You can decide which logo is going to show up here, which colors, all of that. Then it can load full screen with no browser window, or you can decide that you want a different rendering for that PWA. You can decide to see the browser or to just load in a specific screen orientation, for instance. So all of those are options that we can decide on. So because these PWAs are meant to behave like native applications, they can do notifications. So they can notify the user just like a regular native app. They can work offline. And that's a very important point as well, because once you have all of that JavaScript, HTML, CSS downloaded, you could possibly display the application and do something with it. If the work that the application doesn't need data from the web, it could work 100% offline, basically, at this point. And of course, you can uninstall it later. So these are the features, really, that come with a progressive web app. If you have any questions, I can take some questions before moving on to how to actually make a progressive web app. Any questions so far?
What kinds of devices are progressive web apps compatible with? Or maybe are you going to, maybe you're going to dive into that next, but I was just curious because I use a Apple iPhone 7 and I remember being able to use progressive web apps when I had my old phone, which wasn't Apple, but I can't use it on Apple for whatever reason.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, which I always get when I do this talk. So So you're right on. It's a website. A progressive web app is a regular website. So if you have a browser, you can display it. That's the thing. It can work on any device as long as it has a fairly recent browser. Now, the prompt to install, some browsers that don't do it yet. The thing is, Apple is going to do it. They are kind of slower than everybody else in doing it because, of course, when you think about it, a progressive web app is kind of in competition with their own store, right? So you can distribute applications that people can install without going through the Apple Store. So because of that, Apple is a little bit more reluctant than other browser vendors to implement PWAs. But they have to do it because it's a web standard in a sense that every single browser in the world is going to have to support this technology sooner or later. So yeah, it's going to happen. Maybe not right now, but it's going to have to happen. For instance, they already work pretty well with Windows. So you can install a progressive web app on Windows. If you go to any progressive web app and use either Chrome or Edge on Windows, you can have that prompt to install, and it's going to create a shortcut on your desktop, for instance. So I see a question in the chat. Why would someone not use a PWA? That's a very good question. There's no reason not to. Can we use WebAssembly in PWAs? Yeah, as long as the browser that you are targeting is supporting WebAssembly. Again, it's just the best way to describe a progressive web app is that it's just like any other website, with the same constraints in terms of working in a browser on any sort of device. All right, so that was a good first round of questions. So next we're going to dive into how to make a progressive web app. Because to me, one of the most interesting things with PWAs is that they are actually fairly easy to make. And that's because what you need to have a progressive web app is really just two things. The first thing you need 100% to have a progressive web app is HTTPS. So your web application has to be served using HTTPS. If you don't have a certificate, if you only do HTTP, then you cannot have a progressive web app. So that's the first requirement. The second requirement is to create a manifest file, usually called manifest.json. And that manifest has the icon for your application, the name of the application, the splash screen, basically all of the config options. So everything in terms of look and feel for the app. It's really just keys and values, no code at all. If you have these two things, a manifest and HTTPS, then you have a progressive web app. You don't need aid in JavaScript. You don't need any library or anything. HTTPS plus manifest.json is all you need to have the basics of a progressive web app. Meaning that when a browser is going to load a web page with HTTPS and that has a manifest.json reference in the index HTML, it is going to automatically prompt for the install of the progressive web app. So all of that feature basically becomes available for free as soon as you have that manifest and HTTPS. So that's going to prompt the install to home screen. That's going to then put in place everything that we just saw in my demo. So creating the link, splash screen, full screen, all of that stuff just happens through that manifest. Now, of course, when people create apps that they deploy, that they want to run on phones, on mobile devices, they want to do and use some of these native features, say things like notifications or being able to work offline. Because if the connection is not reliable, you want to be able to do some things with that app offline. So that's where a service worker comes into play. A service worker is optional. You don't need it to have a progressive web app, but you're going to need it as soon as you want to do caching. So as soon as you want to do offline, as soon as you want to do notifications, all of these things are going to require a service worker. And these are really the main technologies that are needed. So the manifest, it is a W3C standard. So all of the browsers, they have to support that manifest. And same thing with service worker. It is a W3C standard. It has to be supported by all browsers. So that's an example of manifest.json. As you can see, it's really just a plain JSON file where you give your config for the application. So the name, the URL, the type of display you want for this app. So here it's set to standalone, which means it's going to be on its own, not running in a browser. The description, and then you can provide all sorts of icons with different sizes for different devices. And there's even tools to generate your manifest JSON. So this means that if you have a website that's already running on HTTPS right now, and you want to turn it into a progressive web app tonight, you can just go to this link, fill out the form, click a button, you get your manifest, upload it to your web server, and you have a progressive web app. That's really all there is to it. So that's pretty cool. So there's many generators. This is just one example from Google. There's different options that you can find by Googling around a little bit. Then we have the service worker. So as mentioned earlier, service worker is going to be needed whenever you want to do offline stuff. And that example is exactly that. So this example of service worker is some JavaScript that is going to install, and in that case, pre-cache a bunch of URLs. So my index.html, styles.css, demo.js, all of the things that I want to store so that the application can run without a connection later on. And of course, you can use that to pre-cache the results of some HTTP requests for data. So if you need some JSON data or images or videos or whatever, you can use the same idea to pre-cache all of those so that they become available offline later on. So service worker itself is really the only complex part when you're talking about progressive web apps. That's where you can add a ton of complexity. That's where you can really start to basically write some code, because the package JSON is the manifest JSON is really just a config file, whereas in your service worker you can write JavaScript that is going to be able to achieve quite a few different things. So for notifications, same thing. It's relying on the regular JavaScript APIs for notifications. The only thing you get extra by using a service worker is that when you use a service worker, it's going to act as a proxy between your application and the internet. So that service worker, you can see your service worker kind of as a background process that's always going to be running in the browser of the client. And because it is always running in the background, it can fetch some data from a server. It can ping a server every 10 minutes, every 10 seconds, any time you want to check if there's something new. And when that is the case, it can then prompt a notification that would show up on the mobile device, even if your application is not being displayed right now. So that's one of the ways that you can achieve a native behavior by using a service worker that's going to kind of run in the background, do some polling on the server, and then push some notifications so that the user is going to see your notifications from just like a regular native app. So these are really the basics of progressive web apps and the technologies that come into play when you want to create one. Now, progressive web apps have been around for quite a few years now. I would say that the very first PWAs showed up 4 or 5 years ago, at least, maybe even sooner than that. But it's really an ecosystem that's growing pretty fast. And because it is growing, there's a ton of libraries and tools that emerge to basically help build, test, and deploy progressive web apps. So I want to mention a few of those, unless we have any questions before I move on to that section. Checking the chat. Don't see any new questions here. It's good. Okay, so moving on to the libraries that we can use. So again, all of that is optional. You can really just create a progressive web app with package.json and HTTPS. You don't need any of that. This is really when you want to go one step further and do some offline capabilities, do some notifications, background sync, all of these sort of things. So writing a service worker can get very complex very quickly. And there's a lot of boilerplate code that you have to write. So Workbox is a library that comes from Google, which is a library that makes it a lot easier to write your own service worker. So it's really a bunch of functions and helpers that are going to help you implement pre-caching, runtime caching, the different strategies you want to use to cache. So you can implement strategies such as, if I'm online, I want to get the latest data. But if I'm offline, of course, I'm going to rely on whatever is cached. Or you can say always use offline first, only go online if you've not used that data for more than 24 hours. All of these sort of different options are available with Workbox. So you can decide when to cache what, for how long, all of those different things. Request routing. So I mentioned that a service worker is like a proxy between your app and the internet. So you can decide what to do with HTTP requests. Are you going to catch it and provide a canned response, or are you going to let that request go to the server and do something? So you have control over that as well in your service worker. Background sync, you can have your own process that's going to do some polling to fetch data in the background. Debugging tools also come with Workbox, because one of the tough things to deal with service workers is really debugging, because there's caching all over the place, and when you're working with it, you don't know if you're dealing with cache data or not, and it can be tricky to test things out. So having tools to help debug is really great. So all of that comes with Workbox. It's really a set of utilities to make service workers easier to write. And it's framework agnostic, doesn't have to be, I mean, it can work with Angular, React, Vue, jQuery, anything you want. One of the most recent additions to the PWA ecosystem is something called Bubblewrap. So Bubblewrap is another product from Google, another open source project from Google, where the idea is to say, some people still want to have their apps on the app stores, right? They still want to see their PWA on the Google store and all of that. So Bubblewrap is a set of tools and libraries that does exactly that. Meaning you take your progressive web app, you take Bubblewrap, and you say, hey, create a native Android application out of my PWA. So it's really just a wrapper around your web app so that you can publish it on the Android store. It doesn't change your code in any way, just going to wrap it in a web view that is trusted and that can be put on the App Store. So it is just for Google. There's no as easy equivalent for Apple yet. And another project that is getting more and more traction and is getting really more and more popular is Capacitor. So this one is slightly different in the sense that what you're doing is not just a progressive web app anymore, but you're using Capacitor to turn that progressive web app into actual native Apple, Android, and progressive web app. So you're really creating 3 different applications out of your code. So there's other projects. You've probably heard about NativeScript, Ionic, and all of these other platforms that kind of do something similar. I know that Capacitor is getting a lot of positive traction. Well, it's basically the latest player in that list. So when you start doing things after everybody else, you can learn from their mistakes and do things better. So that's basically what I did. And one other tool I want to mention is Lighthouse. So Lighthouse is it's basically an audit tool that you already have because it is part of Google Chrome. So in the DevTools in Google Chrome, there is this Lighthouse product, which was moved to the audits tab, but I wonder if they haven't moved it back to its own Lighthouse tab. They change it over and over again. Yeah, now it's back to being just Lighthouse. So the idea behind Lighthouse is that you can run an audit on any website and get feedback about it. So what you're doing good, what you're not doing so good. And there's a report for many different categories, including progressive web app. So if you added a manifest and you want to make sure that you didn't make any mistake and that your progressive web app is going to work as expected, you can run a Lighthouse audit using the Lighthouse tab in Google Chrome, and click that button, generate report, and it is going to take a few seconds, minutes. I can actually try it on the Starbucks app. I know they did a pretty good job with that, so they get a really good score in progressive web app. Let's give it a try. So I'm going to do a performance, well, just PWA. You can also get a SEO audit, accessibility, best practices, and this is evolving pretty much months after months. They're improving the metrics that you're tracking, and the report is more and more accurate. So it's always pretty good. Let's do it for Starbucks and progressive web app, see how good they score. It's going to take just a few seconds. And there we go. So it gives a report. I don't see the actual score, but it is telling me that, oh yeah, I should be auditing in incognito mode to avoid my browser extensions to impact the score. So because of that, it's not 100% accurate. It's telling me that the page load is not fast enough. So that's another thing with Lighthouse to be aware of, is that it is using your internet connection. So if you are, let's say, streaming a meetup live while doing your test, well, your connection is not as good as if you were doing nothing. So the test is impacted in that way, which is not ideal. But yeah, you get a report with feedback. So this app is installable, it is PWA optimized, and I get pretty much green stuff all over the place. there's one warning here that this app doesn't have a maskable icon. But that's really it. So that's Lighthouse. I use it even it's pretty good even if you're not doing progressive web apps, just to get feedback on performance, SEO, best practices, accessibility. It is a really nice tool. So with all of that in mind, are progressive web apps the future? Because that was the title of this talk. So is it really the future or not? Oh, I see a very good question in the chat, and I'm going to answer it before I move on to the next section. Lighthouse versus web page test. If you are trying to test performance, I would use web page test instead, because you're going to have a benchmark that is not dependent on your internet connection. So that's better. If you're testing all of the other aspects, so everything but performance, you can use Lighthouse locally on your machine, and it's good enough. So for PWA, all of the other best practices, you can use Lighthouse. But both are pretty good tools to use anyways. It's just that the downside of Lighthouse is really that it's using your internet connection. So if you are streaming or downloading stuff, the score is going to go down for your test for no reason, really. So that's not great for that part. That's really something that they should try to improve. But yeah. So are progressive web apps the future? So as I mentioned earlier, even if progressive web apps are still work in progress, we talked about Apple not being very fast in implementing them. Those are web standards. So if you go to caniuse.com, if you go to the W3C website, you'll see that there's the app manifest, there's a service worker, they are out there, and most browsers are playing along. So right now, well, I took that screenshot a few weeks ago, but it was 86% of support. And most of the mobile browsers are doing it. So Samsung Internet, Baidu browser, Firefox for Android, Chrome for Android, all of the Android ones are pretty good. And iOS Safari and Safari not so much. So there are a few directories with many progressive web apps, such as findpwa.com, pwa.rocks. Those are a little bit outdated these days, I would say. They were used in the beginning to really showcase that there's many different types of progressive web apps out there. But the most common ones are most of the time invisible. For instance, a good demo of progressive web app that I saw a few years ago was an airline company. So, you know, when you book a plane ticket, it's a pain to have to install the app of the airline just to be able to board the plane, right? And if you're like me, you don't like paper tickets, you don't want to download 200 megabytes of stuff just to show your ticket. So creating a PWA for that use case makes perfect sense. And the demo I saw was from an airline in Europe. And what they did is that you would get an email from them, and in the email, you would get a link to your ticket, which was a progressive web app. So when you get to that web page, it would prompt you to install. And when you install, there you go, you have your plane ticket offline, which means when you get to the counter, you can just tap your screen, it shows up right away. Even if you don't have good connection or anything, basically your barcode is there, and you can scan it and go through the security checkpoints and everything. So that was a pretty well thought use case for progressive web app, where you remove the friction to install for the user, you make things fast and efficient, and then it can be removed once you've used it. So it's still something that's more and more present all over the place, and it's going to grow in the future. It's going to grow a lot in 2021. Actually, it's going to grow so much that Google is planning to add a little bit more restrictions to progressive web apps. For instance, one of the things that should happen this year is that in order to be considered a PWA, it is possible that this year we're going to move on to, you would have to have some offline capability, basically. So you would have to have a service worker. If you don't have any, then you would not get the prompt to install. So that's something it's still being discussed. But at the last Chrome Dev Summit, Google said, well, that's something we probably want to do in 2021. Basically make it a little bit more difficult to have PWAs, or at least make them more native in the sense that they have to provide at least a bare minimum of offline capability. So it's evolving, but it's definitely something that's growing. It's definitely something that can be a game changer for many industries. I'm pretty sure many startups can build interesting stuff just by thinking PWAs instead of thinking 100% native. But yeah, we'll see what the future holds for that. So that's all of the content I had for tonight. Of course, you can ask me tons of questions. I'm always available for that. I listed a few links in here, my Twitter, my email, my blog, and I have a progressive web app video course for Angular, which is really more about creating a PWA with Angular. So thanks everyone for your attention. And now we can do a Q&A session. So I saw that we have new questions in the chat. So how do web apps compare to Electron apps? That's a very good question. If you think about performance only, then an Electron app is always going to look better, I would say, in a sense that it is more native than a PWA, but it is also a different approach. It's also a different mindset, I would say. Electron is really more desktop oriented, so you can basically build a lightweight Electron app using a PWA, which is going to be installable as well. It's somewhat similar, but yeah, I think PWAs are more flexible. It's just easier to get started with and to have something that can get installed anywhere in just a few minutes with a manifest.
Alain, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I think this is obvious, but maybe not for people. So the code you write is all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It kind of assumes, though, that you're writing using some sort of SPA-like setup, right? This does not work with a traditional request response, older style website. You can't turn that into a PWA, correct?
You can. You can make a WordPress blog a progressive web app just by providing a manifest. Now, the thing that's not going to fly so much with the progressive web app is that it's not going to work offline, right? You would still need a connection to be able to do something. But even if it's very heavy in terms of HTTP requests or old technology, I took WordPress as an example because it's PHP, it's been around forever. And you add a manifest to it, you have a progressive web app. So that's something pretty important to mention, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Do you, are there particular, I'm wondering if there are particular categories of apps that are good for or not so good for progressive web apps? I would assume that if you want to do games that are going to make use of a lot of, device hardware, probably not so much. But I mean, I like the example of the airline one, but do you have some other examples of where choosing a progressive web app over a different modality would be a good idea?
Yeah, so the Starbucks example is pretty good too. I would say any restaurant, anything where you want to be able to do a quick order without installing anything, all of those are pretty good candidates. So checking in, tickets, buying stuff pretty quickly, all of that, progressive web apps are perfect in a sense that you're not going to lose customers with the install. So games, as you mentioned, you probably want to use any possible optimization that you would get from the native platform. So PWAs, I mean, unless you're not building a 3D game that's super intense, they're not that obvious, I would say, or not that good in that case. Yeah, there are many things that use native apps where I could easily see a PWA instead. So any RSS feed reader, any even things like Slack, chat, all of these sort of things, I don't see the need for them to have a 100% native platform behind them. So yeah, something that any website that you want your users to be able to access pretty quickly from a shortcut on their phone are basically good candidates to be PWAs.
So for the Apple phones that don't quite support, what don't they exactly support? The quick adding of the app to the screen. I mean, the app would load fine, right? On iPhone, it'll work.
Yeah.
If
it works in the browser, it just works. Yeah.
Does it still show up in sort of the Chromeless browser on an iPhone? Or
yeah, it would just open in your tab like a website, like another website. So that's not, you can use it.
Yeah.
And yeah, John made a very good point in the chat. If you want an app that doesn't require App Store control and approval, that's something pretty big, because there's been stories of people basically losing all of their income because their app was removed from a store. Whereas here, nobody has any control over your PWA. In terms of discoverability, that's also a big plus. I can find a PWA from a Google search, which, as we saw at the beginning of the talk, everybody's doing every day, pretty much. Or any search engine request, I would say, not necessarily Google, but we're all using search engines every day. And you can find a PWA like this, whereas with a native app, that's not the case. So make it, you can basically do SEO for a PWA. You cannot do SEO for an App Store app, right? So these are some of the things from a business perspective. These are more business concerns than technical concerns, I would say. But if you want to make your app more visible, more easy to reach, more easy to install, all of those are big pluses for PWAs. Yep.
It's a really great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was outstanding.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, great intro. Good work. Although that's come to be expected from Alain. Every talk that he's given is like fantastic. So.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming and hanging out. Next month, we've got Nick Raboy giving a talk on how to build video games using Unity. That'll be good. Again, third Wednesday of the month, same place. We'll send out the promo for that probably in the next week or so. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.